Let me describe what Iran's new supreme leader looks like right now, based on the most detailed account published so far. He is in hiding. His exact location is a state secret. Senior commanders and government officials do not visit him because Israeli intelligence might trace their movements to his hideout. He was gravely wounded on February 28th in the joint U.S.-Israeli airstrike that killed his father. He has severe burns and injuries that have made speaking difficult. He is awaiting plastic surgery. His president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who is a heart surgeon, has personally helped with his medical care. He communicates through a motorcycle courier chain, handwritten notes sealed in envelopes carried by couriers on back roads to wherever he is. No electronic communication, no video calls, no photographs released since he was named supreme leader in March. His access is, in the words of a senior Iranian official speaking to the New York Times, extremely difficult and limited now. And on Tuesday, an official from the Iranian government said this: "The leadership matter is not what some people in the West think. It is a manageable issue." Now read the Trump post from the same day. Iran has informed us that they are in a state of collapse. They want Hormuz to open as they try to figure out their leadership. State of collapse. Trying to figure out their leadership. Two descriptions of the same institution. One from inside it, one from outside it. One saying manageable, one saying collapse. I want to spend today explaining exactly what the evidence tells us about which of those descriptions is more accurate, what it means if Iran's description is right, and what it means if Trump's description is right, and why that question may be the single most consequential analytical question of this war right now. Let me start with what we actually know about Mojtaba Khamenei's condition, and what we do not know. Because the gap between those two things is where most of the analysis is going wrong. What we know, the New York Times published a detailed investigation based on interviews with more than 20 Iranian officials, former officials, Revolutionary Guard members, and individuals close to the new supreme leader. That investigation is the most sourced account of Khamenei's condition available from any news organization. Here is what it found. He is gravely wounded but mentally sharp and engaged. His access is extremely difficult and limited. He is surrounded mostly by a team of doctors and medical staff. Senior officials and military chiefs do not visit him in person for fear of being targeted by Israeli intelligence. Communication happens through the handwritten note courier chain, sealed envelopes carried by couriers on motorcycles and cars via back roads. He relies heavily on the advice and guidance of senior IRGC generals. The Times found that Mojtaba Khamenei's physical isolation has resulted in a significant shift in power. What it calls the triangle of power, led by veteran IRGC generals, is dictating the survival strategy of the Islamic Republic. The traditional influence of the clerical class is waning in favor of an entrenched military elite. The governance of Iran has moved from the hands of a singular religious figure into what the report describes as collective military leadership. Two specific quotes from the Times investigation stand out. A former advisor to former Iranian President Ahmadinejad told the Times that Khamenei is managing the country as though he is the director of the board, and that he relies heavily on the advice and guidance of the board members. The generals are the board members. Chatham House's Sanam Vakil, director of the Middle East and North Africa program and a source with contacts in Iran, said Mojtaba is not yet in full command or control and is largely presented with fait accompli decisions. Fait accompli means decisions already made and presented to him for formal endorsement, not decisions he is shaping from the beginning. That portrait, mentally sharp but physically isolated, communicating by motorcycle courier, formally supreme but practically ratifying decisions made by generals, is the most detailed picture of Iranian governance that has appeared in Western media since the war began. Now here is what we do not know. We do not know where Khamenei is. We do not know his precise medical trajectory. We do not know whether his communication through the courier chain produces binding decisions, or whether the IRGC generals are effectively acting with or without his explicit authorization. We do not have a photograph. We do not have a medical record. We do not have independent verification of any of the sourced claims, because all of them come from unnamed officials speaking to a newspaper through the Iranian government's gatekeeping. Al Jazeera published an opinion piece by an analyst noting exactly this. The key details of his condition come from unnamed Iranian officials, and there is no photograph, no medical record, no independent verification of any kind. That is the epistemic situation. The New York Times says gravely wounded, mentally sharp, generals in control. The Iranian government says manageable. Trump says state of collapse. We cannot independently verify any of them, but we can evaluate each claim against the observable evidence. Let me do that now. Claim 1. State of collapse. If Iran is in a state of collapse, certain things would follow from that claim. Markets would be pricing in imminent Iranian capitulation, so oil would be falling. The diplomatic initiative would be in American hands, so Iran would be waiting for American terms rather than submitting proposals. Iran's military would be degrading in its operational capacity, so the IRGC would be pulling back from the strait, and negotiations would be driven by Iranian desperation rather than Iranian strategy. Check oil. Brent crude hit $112 on Tuesday. West Texas Intermediate crossed 100. Those numbers represent the market's best assessment of how long the Hormuz closure will last. The market is priced for continued Iranian position durability, not for imminent collapse. Markets are not sentimental and they are not ideological. They price what they believe is structurally true based on all available information. 112 says the market does not believe Iran is collapsing. Check diplomacy. The diplomatic initiative is in Iranian hands. IRGC conducted a 3-continent tour over 72 hours, submitting a formal proposal through Pakistani mediators, meeting Oman's Sultan Haitham in Muscat, and sitting across from Putin in St. Petersburg. He is now back in Tehran preparing a revised proposal on his own timeline. America canceled its envoys before landing and told Iran to use the telephone. Pakistan's mediators are waiting for Iran's next move. That is not the diplomatic posture of a collapsing state. Check military. Iran's IRGC is still operational. Ships are still being seized. Hormuz tolls are still being collected. The Hormuz management plan is advancing through parliament, not retreating. Mahan Air resumed flights to Moscow, which requires IRGC coordination, given the airline's sanction status and operational role. The steel export ban this week, covering slab, sheet, and strip products to protect materials for missiles, drones, and ships, is a strategic war economy decision requiring multi-ministry coordination. That is not military degradation. That is military resource management. Check negotiations. The revised proposal that Pakistani mediators expect is being prepared on Iran's timeline, not in response to an American ultimatum deadline. Iran submitted a first proposal. Trump said not good enough. Iran is now preparing a revised version. That sequence describes Iranian strategic patience, not Iranian desperation. None of those checks support the collapse claim. Every observable data point describes a state under severe pressure that has not broken. Claim 2, manageable. If Iran's leadership is manageable, certain things would follow. Iran's government would continue to function across multiple branches simultaneously. Decisions would be made and implemented at a pace that sustains the war effort. The military would have clear enough chains of command to execute operational decisions. The negotiating strategy would be coherent and sequenced, not chaotic or contradictory. Iran's public communications would project authority rather than desperation. Check government function. Iran's President Pezeshkian is functioning and has been involved in Khamenei's medical care. Iran's parliament is functioning and advancing the Hormuz management plan through committee toward a floor vote. Iran's foreign ministry is conducting diplomacy across 3 continents simultaneously. Iran's customs authority issued a steel export ban requiring coordination across multiple agencies. Iran's central bank confirmed and reported the first Hormuz toll revenue deposit. Those are 5 separate branches of Iranian government making coordinated decisions in the same week. That is not a government that has lost coherence. Check military chains of command. The IRGC Navy is still seizing ships in the strait. The IRGC is still maintaining the minefields. The Larak Island corridor toll system is still operating. Mahan Air, which requires IRGC operational coordination for its sanctioned routes, resumed flights to Moscow. Those are operational military and quasi-military decisions that require command authority at multiple levels. Check negotiating coherence. Iran submitted a formal 3-phase proposal. When Trump rejected it, Iran is preparing a revised version rather than abandoning the negotiating track. That sequence, submit, receive feedback, revise, is coherent strategy. It is slow, but it is coherent. The manageable claim checks out against the observable evidence better than the collapse claim does. The General's Republic, operating through the courier chain to a gravely wounded but mentally sharp Supreme Leader, is producing decisions at a pace the war situation requires. Not at a pace any American diplomat would prefer, but at a pace that sustains the Islamic Republic's position. But there is something important to add here. The New York Times' description of the General's Republic, if accurate, means that Iran is manageable but managed differently than before, not by a supreme leader issuing instructions, by a collective of IRGC generals making decisions in a triangle of power with the supreme leader formally endorsing from his hideout through the courier chain. That is manageable in the sense that decisions are being made. It is not the same as the centralized clerical authority that Ali Khamenei exercised for 35 years. And here is what that distinction actually means for the negotiations. If the IRGC generals are the ones effectively deciding Iran's strategy, and if they are harder line than any civilian foreign ministry official would be, then the Hormuz first proposal that Araghchi submitted through Pakistan is the moderate version of what the generals want. The generals want Hormuz under permanent Iranian sovereign control, with tolls normalized and codified in legislation. They want binding guarantees that America never bombs Iran again, not a ceasefire, guarantees with enforcement mechanisms. They want recognition that the IRGC's proxy network is a legitimate instrument of Iranian state power, not a terrorist organization to be dismantled as part of a deal. And they want Iran's nuclear program treated as a sovereign right, not a proliferation threat requiring supervised dismantlement. Araghchi, as a career diplomat who negotiated the JCPOA in 2015 and understands American red lines, frames those demands in the language of ceasefire and phase negotiation. Phase 1. Security guarantees. Phase 2. Hormuz management. Phase 3. Nuclear. That framing is diplomatically literate. It acknowledges sequencing and offers America an entry point. But underneath the diplomatic language, the substance of each phase reflects the general's maximalist position. Security guarantees mean America cannot bomb Iran again under any circumstances. Hormuz management means Iranian control over the strait. Nuclear means the program survives and enrichment rights are acknowledged. The generals are not asking Araghchi to negotiate. They are telling him what outcome is acceptable and letting him find the language that makes it presentable. That is the General's Republic in operation. And the General's Republic has one primary interest that supersedes every other consideration: survival of the Islamic Republic as an independent military and political entity. That interest does not require centralized clerical authority to pursue. It requires military capacity in the strait, financial sustainability through China's crude purchases, and diplomatic cover through Russia's Security Council veto. The IRGC can operate all three of those instruments without the Supreme Leader speaking clearly, and it has been for 61 days. Now, I want to read you the Al Jazeera analysis piece carefully, because it makes an argument that cuts through the binary of collapse versus manageable in a way that I think is the most accurate frame for this situation. The analyst argues that calling the current moment a shift from clerical moderation to military hardline is a rewriting of 45 years of history. The IRGC was not a force that the clerics restrained. It was the instrument through which the clerical vision was executed. Consider the record under Ali Khamenei, the father. He advanced Iran's nuclear program to the edge of weaponization. He built the ballistic missile program, the drone program, and the network of proxies: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, the Shia militias in Iraq, that threatened Israel, the Gulf states, and American forces across the region for decades. He crushed the Green Movement of 2009 when millions of Iranians protested a stolen election and were beaten off the streets. His regime executed protesters in the crackdown that followed the 2022 uprising. He directed the IRGC's Quds Force under Qasem Soleimani, whose operations killed and maimed American soldiers for years before America killed Soleimani in a Baghdad airport strike in 2020. The clerics were not moderates restrained by the military. The military was the clerics' instrument. Every major missile program, every centrifuge facility, every proxy network was built under clerical direction. The IRGC executed the clerical vision. Calling the current moment a departure from that pattern, where the generals have suddenly seized the wheel from the clerics, misreads the relationship that has existed since 1979. And there is one more piece of the Mojtaba Khamenei story that the Times investigation includes and that most coverage has not emphasized. Mojtaba was a teenage volunteer in the Habib Battalion during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. He is not a civilian cleric who inherited supreme leadership with no military formation. He is a man who volunteered as a teenager to fight in a war. His personal formation is military as much as clerical. The generals who surround him now are not strangers from an alien institution. They are the institutional successors of the people he served alongside as a young man. When he delegates to them and accepts their fait accompli decisions, he is delegating to people whose framework he understands from the inside. That is not weakness, that is institutional coherence. That analysis matters for the negotiations. A general's republic led by people with a shared institutional culture and a supreme leader who was personally formed in military service does not describe an institution in disarray. It describes an institution that has redistributed its decision-making load to adapt to an unprecedented wartime constraint. Now let me Steelman Trump's position on the leadership question, because the fracture he is describing is real, even if collapse is the wrong word. The New York Times confirmed what Trump has been suggesting. Mojtaba Khamenei is not exercising the same centralized authority as his father. Access is extremely difficult and limited. He is surrounded by doctors, not by the clerical council. He is being presented with fait accompli decisions, according to Chatham House. The communication chain, handwritten envelopes on motorcycles on back roads, is not a mechanism for nuanced policy deliberation. It is a mechanism for approving decisions that have already been shaped by the generals. And there are real operational consequences to that constraint. When IRGC needs authorization to move from a first proposal to a revised proposal, he needs to get that authorization through the motorcycle courier chain. Each draft goes out through back roads. Each response comes back the same way. Pakistani mediators told CNN that the process is slow because of the difficulty communicating with the supreme leader. The slowness is not tactical. It is structural. It is a physical and logistical constraint on Iran's ability to make rapid decisions in a fast-moving negotiation. Trump is also right that Rubio questioned whether IRGC had the authority to submit that offer. That question is legitimate given what we now know. If IRGC is submitting proposals that require the general's approval filtered through the courier chain to a gravely wounded supreme leader who is largely presented with fait accompli decisions, then the question of whether any submitted proposal actually commits Iran's ultimate decision-making authority is real. This is not a trivial procedural question. It is the central question of whether a deal can be made at all at the IRGC level, or whether it requires a different channel directly to the IRGC generals who are making the effective decisions. And Trump is right that Mojtaba Khamenei has not been seen or heard publicly since taking office in March. There is no photograph, no audio, no video. The poster on the Tehran street is a poster, not a person. The motorcycle courier chain is a system for keeping him alive, not a system for projecting his authority to the Iranian public or to the world. An institution that cannot show its leader for over 2 months is an institution under genuine strain, even if it is functioning. Here is where the Steelman collapses. A leadership structure that is slow and constrained is not the same as a state in collapse. The difference between slow and collapse is the difference between winning and losing a war. Iran's decision-making is slow because the supreme leader communicates by motorcycle courier, but the decisions are being made. The steel export ban this week, prohibiting the export of slab, sheet, and strip products to protect strategically important materials for missiles, drones, and ships, required coordination across the Customs Authority, the Foreign Ministry, and the military-industrial complex. That is a multi-ministry decision made through whatever channel the General's Republic uses. The Hormuz management plan advancing through Parliament required a legislative agenda. The revised negotiating proposal that Pakistani mediators expect this week required a foreign policy decision reviewed by whatever decision-making process is running from the hideout through the courier chain. All of those decisions happened this week, not slowly in the sense of never, slowly in the sense of methodically. The General's Republic is not in collapse. It is in adaptation. And here is the specific thing that breaks the collapse argument most definitively. Putin publicly announced that he received a personal message from Mojtaba Khamenei. The Kremlin said it. Russian state media ran it. That announcement was made to the entire world. If Iran's supreme leader is in a state of collapse, unable to exercise any meaningful authority, sending a personal message to the Russian president is an extraordinary act of political theater requiring careful coordination between Khamenei himself and the IRGC generals managing his communications. Collapse does not produce that level of coordinated diplomatic signaling. Adaptation does. The one who is right between the two descriptions is the one whose description matches what the evidence shows. Brent at 112. Mahan Air landing in Moscow. IRGC with a revised proposal being prepared. The motorcycle courier chain running envelopes through back roads to wherever Mojtaba Khamenei is healing. The IRGC still seizing ships in the strait. The steel export ban. The parliament advancing the Hormuz management plan. A personal message to Putin. That is not the evidence of a state in collapse. That is the evidence of a state that has been severely disrupted, but has adapted its governance structure to survive under wartime conditions in a way that American strategy did not account for. Manageable was the official Iranian word for it. Adaptive might be more precise. General's Republic is what the New York Times calls it, but none of those words is collapse. And understanding that distinction between a damaged but functioning General's Republic and a collapsing state is the most consequential analytical question of this war right now. Because if America's strategy is built on the assumption that Iran is collapsing and Iran is actually adapting, then American strategy is calibrated to a reality that does not exist. And strategies calibrated to non-existent realities produce outcomes that nobody predicted and nobody wanted. That is not a criticism of American military power. It is a description of what happens when the intelligence picture that drives strategy is based on what you want to be true, rather than what the observable evidence shows is true. Iran said manageable. Trump said collapse. The evidence is closer to one of those descriptions than the other. I will let you decide which one. If you found this useful, push back on it in the comments. I will see you in the next one.